Hey everyone, welcome to the show. Ever feel like you're always chasing more? Like you're on this treadmill of hustle and never quite reaching that place of contentment?
Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. A self-help book that flips the script on this idea that we have to be constantly striving to, earn a good life.
Interesting.
We're talking about gentle, rest more, stress less, and live the life you actually want by Courtney Carver. And if this is already speaking to your soul, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on future deep dives. Oh, and you can find a link to the book in the episode description, by the way. Carver's book, it's really compelling. It suggests there's a gentler way to get to our goals, to actually live a life that feels fulfilling. And the interesting thing is, she doesn't say we need to ditch ambition altogether.
I see. So it's not about giving up on our dreams. Right, exactly. More like she's saying we can approach things with more self-compassion,
Yeah.
and maybe a little less of that need to be perfect all the time. I think it's important to mention that Carver's personal experience with multiple sclerosis really shapes her perspective in this book. She's super open about how her diagnosis made her rethink her whole go big or go home lifestyle and how it pushed her towards this gentler approach. The book is structured around 3 seasons of gentle, rest, less, and rise. Pretty interesting framework, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely. What's fascinating is how that structure acknowledges that personal growth. Well, it's not always a straight line. Sometimes we need to focus on rest. Other times it's all about simplifying. And then there are those times we're ready to take action. It's like the natural ebb and flow of, life itself.
Exactly. And speaking of rest, this book puts a huge emphasis on it, not as a reward, but as a basic need.
Oh, I like that.
And it's not just about getting enough sleep, though she does talk about Matthew Walker and his research on how vital sleep is. It's more about weaving rest into our everyday lives. She even shares a story about nearly collapsing from overwork and how her MS diagnosis was like a wake-up call to prioritize rest. It really made me think about how often we wear exhaustion like a badge of honor. Have you ever felt that pressure to be constantly on like it's a measure of your worth?
Oh, absolutely. It's like this unspoken rule we all have to follow.
Totally. What I find refreshing about Carver's approach is that she doesn't just identify the problem. She gives us actual, practical solutions. Like, in the rest section, she talks about strategies like scheduling little breaks throughout the day and creating what she calls little Saturdays or even gentle months, like little pockets of intentional rest and joy.
Uh,
I love that, giving ourselves permission to slow down without guilt, almost like building mini retreats into our routines. It's not about being unproductive, more like recognizing that true productivity comes from a well-rested mind and body. What do you think? Could you see yourself integrating some of these practices?
yeah, I think so. Especially if you start small. Like maybe instead of trying to change your whole schedule, you just add in a 10-minute break to do something you enjoy.
Right. Or maybe one night a week becomes a little Saturday where you just disconnect and do whatever brings you joy and relaxation. It's all about making rest a conscious choice, not an afterthought. So let's move on to the less section of the book. This is where she dives into ways we can simplify our lives. And this concept of home release really jumped out at me.
Hmm. Tell me more about that.
So it's not just about decluttering our physical spaces, but also our commitments, obligations, even mental clutter. Carver shares her own story about downsizing her home and how it actually brought her more space and contentment. She even suggests this experiment called Just One. Basically, you live with just a limited set of items for a while to figure out what you really need and value. What are your thoughts on that?
It's so interesting, how it challenges our consumerist culture. It makes you question how much importance we put on material possessions. I think what's really compelling is how Carver links decluttering to mental clarity. Like, by simplifying our physical surroundings, we're making room for creativity and reflection, even inner peace.
That makes a lot of sense, like clearing out the mental attic to make room for new ideas and experiences. And it's not just stuff, it's commitments that drain us or mental clutter that keeps us stuck in these negative thought patterns. And Carver doesn't stop there. She gets into less phone, gives us tips for reclaiming our time and attention from, like, the constant demands of our devices. One thing she suggests is removing email from your phone. Ever tried that?
I actually have, and it was surprisingly liberating. It broke that cycle of constantly checking and responding. And the interesting thing is, it didn't hurt my work. Actually, I was more efficient when I set aside specific times for email.
That's a great point. It's not about ignoring our responsibilities. It's about having healthy boundaries, taking back control of our time and attention. Carver also talks about creating screen-free zones, finding activities that are, more fulfilling than scrolling, being intentional with our technology. We'll get into more specifics later, but it's a really interesting concept. Now, I want to touch on something else Carver explores, drinking less. She shares her own journey with giving up alcohol and how it simplified her life and improved her well-being.
Mm.
It can be a sensitive topic for sure, but I think it's important to talk about openly and honestly. And Carver, she's not advocating for total abstinence. She's just encouraging us to look at our relationship with alcohol,
Mm.
to ask if it's truly serving us. She also acknowledges how it can be tricky because of societal norms, like alcohol is so tied to socializing and celebrating. What do you think is the takeaway from her approach to drinking less?
Well, I think it's about becoming more aware of our choices, not about judgment or deprivation, more about making choices that align with, well, with our values and the life we want to create. She makes you ask tough questions like, are we drinking more than we intend to? Are there negative consequences? Do we feel pressured in certain situations?
Yeah, for sure. And it speaks to that overall theme of self-awareness that runs throughout the book. So we've talked about rest and less. I'm really curious to dive into the rise section. But first, let's take a quick break. We'll be back to explore how Carver suggests we use the newfound time and energy from rest and simplifying to go after what truly matters. And guess what? She says we can do it all in a gentler way.
It's interesting, right? Like, she guides us toward rest and simplifying, and then she's like, okay, now rise. But here's the thing. She wants us to do it gently. It's not about abandoning our goals. It's more about approaching them with a different mindset, more self-compassion and less perfectionism.
Yeah, I love that. It's not settling. It's about finding a more sustainable path, a fulfilling path. And one of the practices that really embodies this is go slowly. It's like a direct challenge to this whole culture of busyness. It encourages us to actually be mindful of our pace, to ask ourselves if we're always rushing. How often do we actually slow down and enjoy the simple things or really engage in the things that matter most to us?
Yeah, it's so easy to get swept up in all the demands and lose sight of what brings us joy. Carver reminds us that slowing down, it's not about being lazy. It's about reclaiming our time, our attention, and directing it toward what truly matters.
Right. It's a shift from quantity to quality, being present instead of just constantly racing to the next thing. And she offers some really practical tips for embracing slowness, scheduling fewer activities, building in buffer time, even just savoring our meals instead of rushing through them. These all seem pretty doable, right?
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just external changes, it's also about our internal state. Like, she talks about mindfulness and meditation, practices that help us slow down our thoughts and be more present.
Yeah, I found even a few minutes of mindfulness can make such a difference. It brings a sense of calm. And speaking of slowing down, she also encourages us to cultivate quiet, which in a world that's so noisy and distracting, finding those pockets of silence can be really hard, but it's so rewarding. What are your thoughts on cultivating quiet? How does it tie into this whole idea of gentleness?
Well, when we create those pockets of quiet, it allows us to, like, reconnect with ourselves. It gives us space to reflect, process emotions, just be present with our thoughts without judgments, like a reset for our nervous systems.
It's a form of self-compassion, right?
Right.
Giving ourselves that gift of silence. And she suggests things like having a designated quiet space, scheduling quiet time, spending time in nature, and of course, disconnecting from technology. It's interesting how all these practices, rest, less, and now these practices within Rise, they all seem to connect and build on each other.
They do. It's not about doing just one thing. It's about weaving them together to create a more balanced approach to life.
I love that. And it leads us to the next practice, dive in. It's about taking action towards the things that matter most to us, but doing it from a place of gentleness, self-compassion. Instead of letting fear or perfectionism hold us back, she's saying embrace the journey, even if it's messy. What are some key elements of diving in gently?
I think it's about being clear about what we want and letting go of expectations,
Yeah.
focusing on the process, enjoying the ride, being open to experimenting, making mistakes, and learning from them, and really importantly, being kind to ourselves along the way.
It's so important. We get caught up in that need to be perfect, and it paralyzes us. But it's about progress, not perfection. She gives some practical tips too, like breaking down goals into smaller steps, celebrating our wins, remembering it's okay to ask for help. This one resonated with me. I struggle with perfectionism, and I appreciate how she makes taking action seem less stressful and more enjoyable. Now, let's talk about release every worry. This one can be tough, right? In a world that's so unpredictable, it's easy to get caught up in anxieties. How does she suggest we approach worry in a more gentle way?
Well, she acknowledges that worry is a normal emotion. But she asks us to consider if our worries are actually helpful or if they're just draining us and holding us back.
Right. Sometimes we're worrying about things that might never even happen, and it steals our peace.
Exactly. And even if it's a legitimate concern, just dwelling on it doesn't usually solve anything. It just makes us more anxious.
So how do we escape that worry cycle?
Yeah.
What are some of Carver's strategies?
She suggests becoming more present focused, doing things that bring joy and peace, practicing gratitude. Things like journaling or talking to someone we trust can help us process and release our worries.
Those are all great strategies,
Mm.
and it's important to remember we don't have to do it alone. Support from others can be so helpful. Now let's move on to ask yourself. This one is all about tapping into our inner wisdom, trusting ourselves to make the best decisions. It's so easy to lose touch with our own values and desires with all the outside noise and expectations. So how does she suggest we reconnect with that inner compass?
She encourages us to be really honest with ourselves, to ask questions like, what do I truly want? What do I need? What brings me joy? What are my values? Those questions can help us figure out our priorities and make choices that feel authentic.
It's about tuning out the external noise and really listening to ourselves.
Yeah, and while advice from others can be helpful, ultimately it's about trusting our own gut.
I love that. It's about making decisions that feel right for us, even if they go against what other people think. Okay, so we've covered a lot of practices in the Rise section, all about pursuing what matters in a gentler way. Before we move on, I want to touch on one more that really resonated with me. Savor simple pleasures. It's so easy to get caught up in wanting more, bigger, better, that we forget to appreciate the simple joys that are already around us. What are your thoughts on savoring simple pleasures? How does it contribute to a gentler life?
Well, when we focus on gratitude and appreciate the little things, it shifts our perspective. We start to see what we have instead of what we lack. It's about finding those little moments of joy in the everyday, appreciating the beauty that's right here, right now.
Finding the extraordinary in the ordinary. I like that. Carver gives some great examples. A cup of coffee, a sunset, a good book, a walk in nature, a hug from a loved one. Those are the things we often take for granted, but when we really appreciate them, they bring so much contentment. Now, as we move towards the last part of this deep dive, I want to bring up something we touched on earlier, redefining guilt. It's a reminder that so much of the guilt we carry is based on these societal expectations that don't actually serve us. Carver challenges us to question those messages that tell us we're not enough, that we should be doing more, that we need to be constantly productive. She wants us to let go of that guilt that keeps us striving and embrace a gentler approach. What are your final thoughts on redefining guilt? How does it connect to living a more gentle life?
It's about giving ourselves permission to be human,
Yeah.
to be imperfect, to make mistakes, and to prioritize our well-being. Self-care isn't selfish, it's essential. And we don't have to live up to everyone else's expectations.
It's about accepting ourselves as we are, finding peace in the present moment. And that leads us back to another practice we talked about, decide what not to do. With all the demands and distractions, setting boundaries is crucial. Carver suggests actually making a list of things we're not willing to do anymore. Things that drain us, that don't align with our values. Maybe it's staying late at work, volunteering for everything, checking email constantly, endless scrolling on social media. What are your thoughts on this? How can deciding what not to do help us live more gently?
It's about taking back our power and creating a life that feels true to ourselves. It's saying yes to the things that matter and no to the things that don't.
It's creating space for joy and meaning. Now, as we wrap up, I want to revisit Carver's story, her journey with multiple sclerosis. It's a reminder that life is unpredictable and taking care of ourselves is so important. It also shows the power of gentleness. What do you think is the biggest lesson we can take from her story?
It's a reminder that we don't have to wait for something big to happen, to embrace a gentler way of living. We can choose to prioritize our well-being, simplify our lives, and cultivate joy, starting right now.
That's such a powerful message. It's about creating the life we want no matter what. And that brings us to the core of gentle, finding a better way to live, to work, to just be. Before we wrap up completely, I want to leave our listeners with a question. If you could create a world that embraced gentleness, what would it look like? What would you change? What values would be most important? Take a moment to think about that. Imagine the possibilities. And remember, even small acts of gentleness can make a difference. So that concludes our deep dive into gentle. Thank you for joining us. We hope you found it insightful and inspiring. If it resonated with you, share it with someone who might benefit from a gentler approach. Leave a comment below and let us know what you thought. And subscribe for more deep dives into books that can help us live more fulfilling lives. So as we wrap up our deep dive into gentle, I want to hear from you. What was your favorite takeaway from this exploration? What really spoke to you?
Oh, that's a good question. For me, it's this idea that gentleness isn't about weakness. It's not about being passive. It's actually a source of strength, a source of resilience.
I like it.
It's about facing life's challenges with grace, with compassion, and being willing to slow down and listen to ourselves.
That's a really powerful insight. It challenges this idea that gentleness means you're a pushover.
Right.
Instead, it's saying true strength comes from navigating those ups and downs with balance and self-awareness.
Exactly. We don't have to be constantly pushing ourselves to the limit to be worthy or successful. We can achieve our goals and have fulfilling lives by embracing this gentler approach, a more sustainable approach.
Totally agree. Another thing that really stuck with me was redefining guilt.
Mm.
It's so easy to feel guilty for taking breaks, for setting boundaries, for putting our well-being first.
Oh, for sure.
But like Carver says, so much of that guilt comes from these societal expectations that don't really serve us.
Yeah, those old narratives that we need to let go of, embrace a more compassionate way of being.
Right. It's about recognizing that we deserve rest, rejuvenation, self-care without needing to apologize. So before we say goodbye, I want to leave our listeners with a question, something to think about. What's one small act of gentleness you can extend to yourself or someone else today? It could be anything. Taking a few minutes to enjoy a cup of tea, sending a kind message to a friend, just giving yourself a moment of quiet reflection. Remember, even the smallest things can make a difference. They can ripple out and create a more gentle and compassionate world. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into gentle. We hope you found it insightful and inspiring. And if it resonated with you, please share it with a friend who you think might also benefit from this gentler approach to life. Leave a comment below. Let us know what spoke to you most. And be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into books that can help us all live more fulfilling and meaningful lives. Until next time, embrace the power of gentleness.